American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 7, Political Parties. In this segment, we'll be going over the learning objectives of discussing how electoral structure influences how political party systems are set up, and providing a brief description of the American party system as well as how it's been experienced over the past decades. So let's take a look at electoral structure and see, does it influence political party structure? Now, to understand this, we first have to define the different general types of party systems. Now, most obviously, we start with the one-party system. Here, the representatives of a single political party hold all or almost all the major offices in government. Now, this might be due to legal restrictions, or it just might be due to extensive power exerted by one group over society. The examples that we see are Nazi Germany, Mexico until the turn of this last millennia, as well as the post-Reconstruction U.S. South, including Arkansas, which until only very recently was dominated by the Democratic Party. Indeed, most people refer to this state as one and a half political party state. Now, there's also a multi-party system, in which case there are three or more political parties effectively compete for political offices, and there is no one single party that can win sole control of the government. And we see these examples in Japan, Israel, and Germany, and oftentimes they're parliamentary systems which have different voting rules from those of the two-party systems, in which you have only two political parties that have a realistic chance of winning control over a significant number of political offices. Now, with this, we see the examples of Australia, Austria, Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, and the United States. Now, interestingly, with Canada and Great Britain, these are often seen as 2.5 party states, in which there are political parties that move in and out of political control, but it's not as stable as the United States. So let's take a look at the reasons for this. Now, one of the major reasons can be seen in the electoral rules that are up. Now, first of all, we see that with single-member district plurality, in other words, the SMDP systems, you have winner-take-all. And this makes it hard for minor parties to win offices. So in other words, what we see here is that when individuals win their election, and they're only ones, and that's usually 50% plus one, this first past the post approach can be seen as limiting the amount of political parties that can become involved. Now, on the other hand, you might have proportional representation systems that likely have multiple parties, and this is due to the fact that within proportional systems, you might have individuals who win a very large proportion of the vote, but they aren't the ones with the most votes, but they still are seated within the representative body. So this differs from the winner-take-all system in that only one person will be seated. So the next approach is considering presidential systems. Here, with the separation of the executive and the legislature, with their independent election, this prevents coalition governments. So, with parliamentary systems, the party or political parties that control the majority of legislative seats choose the chief executive. So, if they're already seated, they've won their seats, they're sitting in their chamber, and they're trying to bring in their executives. What they'll do is they'll be able to develop coalitions with other groups that are also in that body. Now, within the presidential system, with the winner-take-all system, which specifically our electoral college system is, this limits this because the president is elected by the people through the electoral college. Now, lastly, and connected with this presidential system is the public financing, which makes it exceedingly difficult for anybody else except for the representatives of the two parties to get on presidential campaigns and receive the exposure and money that comes from this. Now, lastly, we see that state laws, each of the 50 states have different laws, regulate access to the ballot, and this can likewise be seen as an impediment for another political party to rise to the forefront, although it does happen on occasion. So, some of the reasons for this, besides the structure, there's also a natural perpetuation of the two party system. So, with all the foregoing that we've discussed, we see that this has become a part of the traditional patterns that are embedded within our political socialization process. So that when you grow up, you consider yourself a Democrat or Republican if you consider yourself political at all. At the same time, the two major parties attract the best political and leadership talent. And of course, that's what they're supposed to do, is get the best and develop the best political talent that they can find. And then lastly, what we see is that political conflict is challenged into two major outlets. First, you have the organization in power, and then you have the one out of power. And certainly that plays a major role in where the power is, because even when you're out of power, you still have the ability to draw attention to the other political party, and by being the focus, that is a level of power. Now, there's also another factor, and that which is discussed in the book and provided here in Figure 7.1 is just plain history. As we can see here, the Democratic Party, in one form or the other, has been a part of the American political landscape since the turn of the 18th century. And the Republican Party has been around for an exceedingly long time, over 150 years. So they've been in competition over a long period of time. Now, their party platforms have changed radically over the years with different realignments, but the structure of our system remains the same despite the fact that we have had different political parties run for office at the presidential level, including recently Reform Party, Green Party, Libertarian Party, and so on and so forth. So, next question comes to, how do Americans identify with their political parties? So, with a lack of a set political identification, there's a good deal of ambivalence towards politicians and politics. So the question is how many people are strong identifiers with the political parties and how many are not? And what we saw in the previous segment is that there has been a de-alignment, although there has been indeed a realignment in party identification. Now, with the de-alignment, there were fewer people that identified with one political party or the other. So you had a movement from straight ticket voting, the practice of voting for only one party's ticket, to split ticket voting, which is the practice of voting for candidates of more than one party in the same election. So that certainly is a pattern to take a look at when we try to understand the connection Americans have with the different political parties. And this is indeed an indicator of the strength of the party in government. See, most of the 20th century since World War II has been marked by the Republicans controlling one wing of the political system and Democrats the other. In other words, there's been a balance of power, a split government as it is. So the reason for this include, first, a decline in partisanship and party loyalty. And this is something that's been discussed earlier, and we'll go back to see if this is really the case. There's, secondly, an increase in personal appeals due to television. And this is certainly something that we can understand, is that television allows our politicians, especially those at the national level, to actually come face to face, virtually, with the voters. And there's also, thirdly, a preference for a president that's committed to a set of diffuse collective goods. In other words, the president is there to provide goods for all, whereas Congress is dedicated to minimizing what voters have to give up. In other words, they're both playing Santa Claus to a certain extent. In other words, the president provides the goods, yet the Congress basically states, no, we don't want to have to pay for these goods because it hurts locally. So when we take a look at straight ticket voting, we see that it's actually dropped, but it has risen up to a certain extent over the years. And so while this pattern shows a drop since the 1950s to a low in the late 1970s, early 1980s, more recently we're seeing that people are voting more straight ticket. And we see likewise these patterns in which divided government at the federal level increased from 1982 to 2000, but generally speaking, we've seen a pattern where it's about 50% of the time that we do have divided government. And lastly, when we look at party votes in Congress, while certainly there wasn't the connection with the political parties during the 1960s and 1980s, it has grown to a great extent in recent years, so it's near the highs that were experienced very early on in our republic. So ultimately, when we think about political parties, we have to think that this is a means by which people group themselves and identify with active groups, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. And so while people might vote split ticket and might vote for candidates based upon their personality, political parties still play a major role. Now, while this might be a result of rational behavior, I also believe it is due to the fact that humans are very much group creatures and like to identify with a group and maintain this identification oftentimes when it goes against their very best interests, because being with a group might be something that is more important than their individual interests. American national government.